It might actually be the most derivative one of all. I mean, Christ, the same house.
Maybe so. But you forgot the first rule of surviving a stab movie. Never answer the...
I'm bored.
Wait!
And welcome back to Micro Queers. It's our, whenever the hell we feel like doing it, queer horror movie review and short roundup. I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace, and we are discussing Alexander McGregor Birrell's The Latent Image, the feature-length adaptation of his short of the same name, with the whole cast returning?
Well, I mean, it was a very small cast, so it does make sense. But yes, folks, if you are like, hey, wait, this sounds familiar, maybe I've seen this, it's because we had previously talked about the short on a previous Micro Queers episode.
Yes, I actually think this might have been like in 2019, maybe the second year, maybe it was 2020, but
I think the second year, yeah.
Yeah, but we've been hearing about this for a while, and I'm happy to say, yeah, it's finally out, and we can finally see this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's very queer.
It's very queer, yeah. So if you've seen the short, then you're already familiar with the premise. But essentially, it's a writer who has rented out a cabin in the woods to work on a manuscript, and a random, dark, handsome stranger comes in, and we get a certain amount of fantasy with regard to this writer imagining like sexual relationships with him, but also this man is clearly dangerous. So in the short, it was a lot of interplay between what is the story that the author is writing and what is actually happening. And then it, of course, ends somewhat ambiguously. And then here we've got the same idea with one additional character, a few more dream sequences, and about an 80-minute runtime.
Oh, and I do want to point out, just in the interest of full disclosure, both you and I are friends with the lead actor, Ben, played by Joshua Tonks, and the executive producer, Michael Verratti. So I just want to throw that out there before we start diving into this.
This is true. Yes, we know several people who are associated with this production, which in part is why we were able to get our hands on an early screener, and also why we wanted to talk about it, because you're right. I think one of the best things about this is how just unabashedly queer it is.
Oh, yeah. And I'm happy that we're starting to see a lot more of this in the indie horror set. I mean, shit, we get full dick in this movie.
We do get full dick. We get quite a lot of underwear shots. David Dakota would be proud.
Yes. It was so funny because at one point when I was taking my notes, I was like, he should just walk around in his underwear a lot when there's a stranger in his house. But you know what? Would I be saying the same thing if it was a woman walking around in bra and panties? I don't know.
Is it an 80s movie? Because if so, you would say nothing. It would just be everyday occurrence.
I know. It's just, we're wired, I feel like, when we see bulge to be like, oh.
Yeah. So, okay, Trace, overall impressions. Would you recommend this film? Did you like this film?
Yeah, I would recommend this. I will confess, this is a soft recommendation for me.
Okay.
I like the unabashed queerness. I actually think it's shot very, very well, to the point where I really want to see what Birrell does next, as well as his cinematographer, Michael Elias Thomas. I think Joshua does really well in this lead role. I think the acting is strong. Jay Clift is menacingly enough as the man. But this does kind of fall into that trap of a short stretched out to feature length. And especially given the aforementioned nightmare sequences, it feels like there's a lot of padding on this that kind of makes this... It works more than it doesn't for me.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear the sort of trepidation, and you're trying to dance around like, how do you say this? You can be honest with this. This is a relatively slight premise, and there are, I don't want to say draggy points, but there are slower moments. Whereas in the short, because it was kind of a hot 20 to 25 minutes, it didn't feel like we had as much fat per se. So I'm in agreement with you, although I'm a little bit warmer on this. So this is a 3.5 for me. I agree with you that I think it's actually really, really well shot. We're getting some really fun split diopters, deep focus.
Oh, yeah. POV shots from inside the typewriter.
Yeah, so there's a sense of playfulness that I think is making up for the fact that in some ways this could actually be a stage production. Like, that was really my takeaway having seen this a second back in time, is that I could very easily see this as a kind of Agatha Christie, Alfred Hitchcock style stage production where we've got limited actors. It's a little bit heavy on mood and dialogue, but at the end of the day, it's also a relatively slight narrative. It's just these two guys and they're sort of dancing around each other trying to figure out what their motivations are. And I think for some people, that's just not going to be quite enough.
Well, and I think, and I'm not saying that this is not a ripoff to me, but I think it does bear quite a few similarities to Secret Window.
Okay, yes, very much a how much can we trust our protagonist who is a spiraling writer, and we're getting that interplay between fantasy and reality.
Yeah, and he's on the outs with his significant other who may or may not be a murder victim of the antagonist of the movie.
Right. So that is one of the new elements for this feature. So in the short, I think we maybe hear a reference to a partner. There might be a phone call. I can't recall.
Yeah.
But there's definitely no glimpse of him. There's no suggestion that he is a victim of the man. And I think that was one of the smarter ways that if you're going to keep the nearly identical narrative, that's a good way to add additional intrigue, right? Is what is the motivation for Ben, the writer, to come out here? It's not just to finish the book. It's actually because he's running away. And then you can introduce this extra character who, of course, in the grand tradition of thrillers, is going to be killed.
Yes, absolutely. Although I will say, I like, because the film does play around with the narrative a bit in a fun way, when it's like, oh, are we watching real life or are we watching the story that the real life person is telling? Have we even met the real Ben? We don't really know up until kind of towards the end. Although I guess even then it could be up for debate.
Yeah, I actually found that a stronger component of the short, which felt like it was really leaning into story versus reality. Here, I took most of this to be reality. And then you're right, we are getting, there's a nightmare sequence about 8 minutes in where Ben imagines that he's just slashed in the throat by an assailant. And then there's other parts where he's having conversations with his partner, Jamie. So Jamie leaves him a couple of voice messages, but there's also a couple of parts where it seems like we're either flashing back or Ben is imagining Jamie there to help guide or inform his actions. And I liked that interplay. To me, that didn't feel like, oh, this is him writing his story. This is him utilizing another character who's an important part of his life.
Yeah, no, and that does make sense. But, okay, so let's then, I'm just going to come out and say it.
Sure.
I think that these nightmare sequences, which I think we get 4 of them, maybe even 5. There's a bunch of them at the end. In general, we talked about this back in August when we talked about horror tropes that gotta go. And one of my big ones was when we see a scene and something big happens, like be it plot-wise or a burst of violence or whatever. And then, oops, it's the character having a nightmare or it's the character imagining things. And
right.
We do that several times in this movie. This is one of the first 10 minutes. And I was okay the first time, and you could make the argument, as I think you might, actually, you specifically, that because we're playing with this kind of narrative and fiction and writer, author, like, it does play a thematic, like, role in the story.
Right.
I will confess, though, that by the fourth or fifth time this happened, I was kind of like, okay, this feels like we're just padding the runtime because we are stretching a 20-minute short into an 80-minute movie.
Yeah, I had a feeling that this was going to bother you, not just because we did talk about it, but also because, yeah, some of these definitely feel superfluous. I don't mind the first one because, it's relatively early in the film. We're establishing the fact that Ben does have this active imagination, and it's a burst of violence to kind of get the film started.
Sure.
So I was fine with that. I really like the stuff with Jamie. So when he imagines that Jamie is there and then Jamie goes down on him, I liked that kind of stuff because we actually see a very clear transition to, okay, that was in his mind. And then we just see Ben masturbating. And then the man says, hey, what the fuck are you doing over there? So I thought that there was a good interplay between hallucination or memory and reality. And, we keep the man involved in that. The fucking works for me. That is a carryover from the short, although I found it less sexy and far more aggressive in the feature. Yeah. So I remember actually getting turned on in the short and thinking, oh, this is a really fun, sexy way to do this. And I think I even mentioned how I associated that with the sequence from 6 Feet Under where David picks up the hitchhiker and it's a scary, sexy danger.
Yeah.
So that was working for me. But then you're right. There's a couple of moments right near the end of the film where we have the man killing Ben and then Ben coming back in two different jump scares. So one when the man is showering, and then another when, like, immediately afterwards when the man wakes up in bed and Ben is right there and it's his decomposing body. And they're back to back. We've seen this a bunch of times in horror films. I found these very unsuccessful. I knew what they were trying to do, but for me, I was just like, no, we don't need this here.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to do twist after twist after twist almost. I actually don't mind the blowjob one. I don't really like the sex one because I guess for me, the first one with the throat slash and the sex one, I don't really like as much because it's like, okay, we're getting major plot points, and I know we're not going to kill this character in the first 10 minutes of the movie, whatever,
right.
But we have important story developments, be it our main character getting killed or our main character fucking the antagonist. And then we walk it back to be like, oh, it's just a dream. And I get that these things are kind of parts of like, oh, like, do I want to incorporate this into the story of my book? I almost would have preferred it if we had voiceover of him narrating. Like, we know when these sequences start, that these are his ideas for the story and he's writing this out. But the way it is, it feels like almost a cock tease of something, of a more exciting movie that we're not going to get because these are dream sequences.
Right. So is it also that there's too many of them? Like if there was only a couple, you would be a little bit more generous?
Yeah, or again, if we had a voiceover on this, it feels like the movie's like playing a trick on us, and I don't like that. Whereas though, I mean, I get that you could make the argument with the blowjob scene with the boyfriend. I actually do like that because it feels, I don't know, it feels more organic in the moment, and it doesn't feel like it's a trick where it's like, oh, his boyfriend's not actually here. It's more like oh, he's actually hallucinating, as opposed to imagining something in his head. Does that make sense?
Yeah, to me it's actually very, very clear that that's not a hallucination. Like he's just wishing his boyfriend was there.
I guess that's what makes it better for me, right? Because it's clear that this is not real.
I don't know. I think when it starts, it's not clear, and then it becomes clear by the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not going to go pick through each scene, but just overall, and maybe you're right, because we do have this a lot in this film, and some are more successful than others, but by the end of it, I was like, movie. Don't do this again.
Well, can we talk about one that I think is going to work better for you, which is where the two characters walk through how the man would hypothetically kill Ben by actually role-playing it.
Yeah, this I thought was great. I loved this. It was tense, it was sexy, it was dangerous, all for it.
I think the other reason that this really worked for me is that it's very clear that Ben is going along with it, because even though he probably does recognize he's in a certain level of danger, you're right, it is sexy and he's clearly turned on. Like there's one point where Ben gets tied up and the man is kind of threatening him with a knife, and Ben just goes, better kill me quick. I can't take anymore. And you're just like, this sounds porny, like in a good way. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just that Ben is so clearly into this as a kind of foreplay. And this is when the man drops an F slur.
Yes.
And Ben's immediate reaction is like, oh, this isn't fun anymore. We're not having sexy fun times. You're homophobic. You're threatening. Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, no, this was, and I love that he calls him out on it later. Yeah, no, this whole sequence really, really worked for me.
And we get a taste of this in the short as well, right? Where I do think it's more voiceover. It's more him kind of imagining how this could play out. So the film extends this to the point where, you know, we even get a sequence where Ben tries to leave in the car, but it's clear that the man has actually tampered with it. I'm curious, Trace, what do you think of the extension of the man's storyline that he has been to this cottage before, that there is a serial killer who has been actively preying here? You know, we've got a bit of a murder board on the wall. And then we're also discovering the identities of other men in the man's trunk.
Yeah, I think this is all fine. Okay. It seems like he is specifically targeting queer men, though, which I don't, like, it doesn't really... I don't know. I guess, do I want more of an explanation or a motive for that? No, I don't need a motive because the mystery is part of this character's appeal.
Right.
But why is he only going after gay men? And I kind of was hoping that maybe part of the feature-length extension of this would be maybe delving into that a bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely not clear if he's just going after people who are in this area because this is his preying ground.
Right.
Or if this happens to be, I'm thinking of the movie The Retreat, where there's literal homophobic people who rent out an Airbnb to queer people so that they can murder them because they want to rid the world of queer people.
Yeah. And look, do I need that kind of a thing in this movie? Maybe not.
It's heavy. That's a whole premise of a feature film. So if you're not going to go there, you can't just do a little bit of it.
And this is more intimate, right? As you said, this could be a play. We're just with two people mostly in well, actually, we never even really get to meet Jamie alive. It's always a hallucination.
Right. Yeah, we get a phone call or two, and that's the only real interaction we have of him. But I will say, I think one of my favorite scenes in the feature compared to the short, because of course Jamie's not in the short at all, is the moment where Ben discovers Jamie's body and he climbs into the grave with him after he's got a free moment where he can actually do a bit of grieving. And this is another instance where, yes, it's him imagining things, but I like the fact that he gets to have almost a hero moment where he realizes, oh, Jamie's still alive. He's actually not that badly injured. He can save him. They can repair the relationship. They can maybe go on with their engagement. And I liked that crushing blow of then seeing, oh no, Jamie's fucking dead. He's been dead the whole time. And Ben just needed this moment to process.
Yeah. And see, this makes sense to me. Like, this gives me enough justification for this kind of a hallucination. So this didn't bother me in the slightest.
Okay. It does seem like the Jamie stuff works a little bit better for you than the kind of casual nightmares of violence.
Yeah. And even with the sex scene, it's like, honestly, if I had just seen him like looking like lustfully after the man and then we kind of cut to this like sex scene, it's just the fact that it feels like the movie's playing a trick on us. We're being like, oops, psych, it's not real. It's all in his head.
Right. Yeah, I didn't have as strong a reaction to that, but maybe it's just because that scene is in the short, so I anticipated we would see it again.
Well, and actually on that note, so knowing the short, were you surprised by anything that happened in this film, or did the narrative kind of play out exactly like you thought it would? Because it is a pretty straightforward adaptation of that short film.
Yeah, I would say that the Jamie stuff is the big innovative piece for me. It's not that I didn't care, but I didn't know how much more learning about the man's activities contributed to it. I enjoyed getting to see a little bit more cat and mouse. Some of it felt a little bit questionable in terms of like, why can't Ben just drive him back to town? Oh, there's a storm and it'll take you 2 hours. Like, some of this felt a little bit manufactured for drama, but
okay, I love the when so they mentioned the storm and I was like, is it raining? And then I'll cue like thunder sounds.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff where you either have to let it go or you're probably going to be particularly bothered. For me, the one that I didn't really care for was there's a moment where they're both out in the woods and I think Ben has just hit the man in the face with the shovel and we get this howl of wolves on the soundtrack. And I just thought, are we going to do that? I don't want to do that. So thankfully we don't hear them anymore. But, I like the fact that we get a chase sequence with flashlights and telephones, and there's some really good stuff with lighting. I really like the production design by Brendan Haley where, we've got sort of Christmas lights going down the stairs of the cottage. And then there's one red vertical light. I thought that it was atmospheric. Like, they really did a better job, I think, of shooting within the cabin because they had more time to play with their setups.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, again, like I said, the camera work in here is actually much better than what I thought going in. Because, I mean, this is a low budget film,
Sure, it's independent. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you. But, like, I don't know. I felt like there was a lot of fun happening behind the camera that I wasn't expecting when I turned this movie on. And so that's why I'm saying, like, I think technically there's a lot to really appreciate in this film. A lot of my shortcomings do come from the script.
Right. Yeah. It's the tricky thing, right? We've talked about this a couple times, and I feel like we'll talk about it a couple more times. It's difficult to justify extending a short into a feature without feeling like, oh, are you just taking that same idea but now you're adding, an hour to the runtime. And I do think that for me, this film does enough to justify its existence as a feature, if only because I'm also sure that a bunch of people wouldn't have checked out the short. To them, this is just going to play like a feature, and they're probably going to delight in some of these imaginary nightmare sequences as well as the great camera work and the strong performances.
Yeah, for sure. And to be clear, like it's just going to be a hard way to win me over with these nightmare sequences, because if it's a short film like this, I'm going to say, wow, you're just padding the runtime. But if it's like a 2.5 hour film that has a bunch of these things, I'm going to be like, wow, you could have used a tighter edit.
This is why Trace put it on his list of horror tropes that gotta go.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, anything else?
I will say, okay, no shade to Jay Clift, who plays the man. I actually think he is very attractive, not in this film. The problem is with the hair he has, he very much reminds me of Tommy Wiseau.
Yeah, I'm actually happy you said that, because I definitely had those same thoughts. The longer hair, maybe it works for other people. We're very much on the record as not always loving the long hair, so it doesn't do it for me. It's very weird. I was certain that this was a different actor playing the man than in the short, to the point that I had to go back and look at the cast. And you're right. No, it's the exact same cast. And I don't know that I like Jay Clift's performance as much here as I did in the short. I actually think that Tonks gets better and Clift gets a little bit worse. Not bad. It's just, I think he's more mysterious in the short, and that works a little bit better for me. Whereas all of the Ben stuff, we get to know him a little bit more as a character, and I was appreciative of that because he's our protagonist.
Yeah, and maybe that is kind of like not the failing, but like a consequence of extending it, right? Because when you have the villain on screen for more time, he becomes less mysterious.
100%, yes. And the reality is that this is a 2-person film. So he's going to have to be on here more, because if not, it's a 1-person movie. In this case, it's just a monologue. So we need him there, or we need other characters. And as we said, it's low budget. We don't have a lot of people to work with. I'm pretty sure this was shot during part of the pandemic, so there were probably safety concerns. But at the end of the day, I felt like this was a less interesting character, maybe because we were seeing so much more of him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Not a deal breaker by any means, but I agree with you. I do think it was more successful in the short.
Yeah, no, the hair is the deal breaker.
The hair is pretty...
It's problematic because you could look him up on IMDb and he's got short hair and he's really hot.
Yeah, he's very hot, but he doesn't look like the same person.
Yeah, like imagining the full frontal but with shorter hair, that's working for me.
He is Canadian though, so go knock on his door.
Oh my God. Yes, I'll just walk across Canada and find him.
All right, everyone. Well, that has been The Latent Image. Let us know what you thought. And if you did watch the short, let us know, how does this compare for you? But yeah, until our next minisode, we can cross out The Latent Image.
Indeed, and cross out microqueers.
Atlas Avenue, a long stretch of road that encompasses everything the city of Kennett Heights has to offer. Neon lights, traffic, crime, the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and the craziest of characters. My office was above it all. My name is James Locke, and I'm a PI.
Hello, Mr. J. How the hell you doing today?
Good, Edith. Nearly every year I have a new case. New people to meet, new clues to discover, and new problems to solve. But I do it the old-fashioned way. No technology. Nothing post-1950. Hell, I don't even listen to podcasts, but you should. Atlas Avenue Beat is a spoof of the film noir genre with goofy characters, tons of wordplay, and non-stop raunchy humor. There's also 3 whole seasons out right now with more on the way. Just search for Atlas Avenue Beat wherever you listen to podcasts or visit us online at bloody.fm.